For more on this, we can speak with William Black. He's a former federal regulator and a professor of economics and law at the University of Missouri. He is also the author of The Best Way to Rob a Bank is to Own One. Well, we don't own one here, but I am curious. You heard part of Trace's story there, the global banks. Are we in the clear with that now? Do we need to worry?
No, you will not find out whether banks will be able to get through a next crisis through these stress tests. So AIG, Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns, Fannie and Freddie, the three Icelandic banks, they all passed stress tests months, in some cases days before they collapsed. So stress tests are overwhelmingly a propaganda exercise.
Okay, well, that said, what is the right test then we should look at when we look at the banks?
You should look at asset quality, and you should look at quality of core earnings, and you should look at cash as opposed to nominal accounting flows. You should look and be very skeptical when they reduce their loss reserve provisions, which is what Wells Fargo, for example, has been doing, and Citi have been doing for quite some time now, even though they have very high levels of non-performing loans. And you should look at the fact that they changed the accounting rules when the crisis hit, under the theory that these were only temporary losses. And I would note that we are 6 years later, and they still have not ungimmicked the accounting rules on loss recognition.
Okay, I want to share something personal with you, because this is a frustration of mine as I look at the system. The stress test for our viewers, we essentially test what happens if a certain amount of loans default, what happens if interest rates rise, what happens if home prices fall, and there's all these things that get taken into account. And the probability of all of them happening at once, yes, there's a chance, but it's an Armageddon scenario. Isn't there some sort of middle ground we can take that if this reasonable crisis happens, what does the banking system look like?
Now, the Armageddon is the problem. So Fannie and Freddie always called theirs a nuclear winter scenario that was impossible to imagine. They couldn't even get through a single brisk day in the fall of 2008. So no, these are not designed to be remotely close to Armageddon. They are not designed to see whether a bank could in fact survive a financial crisis. And that's impossible through these kinds of stress tests, because if you look at things that kill banks very quickly, it's going to be liquidity, it's going to be people calling lines and such, and stress tests can't look at those kinds of questions.
Professor, do you think there's going to be another crisis, and when?
Oh, yes, there was. We have created the circumstances that produce not only recurrent crises, but ever bigger crises. We're going to have to get to a recovery phase before we get a really big crisis, because that will be another bubble bursting.
Okay. I don't want to make people worry, but you have a lot of regular people who are watching this show. You have people working at this program, and when you talk about another crisis, it makes people worry. What are they to do?
Well, people should worry. That's the first step to fixing problems. So first, they should fix the too big to fail problem. Second, they need to get competent regulation and real regulators in. Third, they need to fix executive and professional compensation, which right now creates incredibly perverse incentives. So the superstar CEOs, the ones with the really big salaries, we all know in finance and criminology, they are much more likely to fail, much more likely to be engaged in fraud than folks who supposedly have lower performance.
All right. This crisis, I have to ask you, what's going to trigger it? What are we looking for?
Well, you're going to be looking for bubbles again, which is why I don't think you're going to get one until you get into a much more robust recovery phase. Now, obviously, from the US and EU context, you could have emerging markets crises, and you could have Chinese crises that could tip particularly the Eurozone back into recession, since it's just barely out of recession. But that won't be the sharp banking crisis of the kind that we saw, where basically every financial market was in danger of collapsing.
Professor, I've only got a few seconds left. I have to ask you this. If I gave you money today, where would you put your money? Is there any bank you think is safe?
Yeah, in the United States context, there are a whole host of regional banks that are very safe, that do very prudent job of banking, and have survived for hundreds of years in good times and bad.
All right. Email me that list. I will forward it on to our colleagues here at CCTV. Professor, thank you very much for joining us this evening.